1. The final 48 hours began. It was the morning of April 29, 1945, in Berlin, a city already reduced to rubble. The air trembled with the thunder of Soviet artillery. Smoke filled the streets, and the once mighty German capital lay dying. In the depths below, beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler sat inside his concrete fortress, the Führerbunker. This was the second last day of his life. The man who had once commanded armies across continents now commanded only shadows and silence. Above him, the world he built was collapsing, piece by piece, street by street. Inside the Führerbunker, the bunker was dark, damp, and filled with the stale air of fear. It was a maze of narrow corridors, steel doors, and flickering lights. The smell of sweat, oil, and despair hung in the air. Hitler's staff, secretaries, guards, and officers moved quietly through the hallways, whispering to each other. No one dared speak loudly. Every sound echoed through the cold concrete. Outside, artillery shells crashed closer each minute. Hitler's physical decline. Hitler was no longer the fiery leader of 1939. He was now a trembling old man, frail, hunched and broken by years of paranoia and illness. His left hand shook uncontrollably. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. Witnesses later described him as a ghost of himself. He rarely slept, barely ate, and spent most of his time staring at maps that no longer meant anything. The armies he pointed to on those maps had long been destroyed. Berlin under siege. Above ground, Berlin was burning. Soviet troops had broken through the last defenses and were advancing from every direction. The Red Army's tanks were only a few streets away from the Chancellery. The once proud city was now a graveyard of stone and smoke. The citizens who remained hid in basements, listening to explosions that shook the ground beneath their feet. There was no hope left, only survival. Denial and delusion. Yet, deep in the bunker, Hitler refused to accept defeat. He still dreamed of phantom armies that could turn the tide of war. He gave orders to divisions that no longer existed, believing salvation was just hours away. His generals stood before him, silent and pale. They knew the truth. The war was lost, but no one dared tell him outright. Any word of surrender would be considered treason. Eva Braun's last hours. In another womb, Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, sat quietly at her dressing table. She had chosen to stay with him to the end. Outside, the world was ending, but she smiled as she arranged her hair. On that morning, she put on a simple blue dress. She wrote a letter to her family, telling them not to grieve, for she had chosen her fate willingly. Her devotion was blind, but it was complete. The wedding in the bunker. Around midnight, in the early hours of April 29th, Hitler and Eva Braun were married. It was a brief and solemn ceremony inside a small conference room of the bunker. The witnesses were Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and 2 secretaries. Hitler signed his name shakily on the marriage certificate. Eva smiled. It was the first and last time she would be called Mrs. Hitler. The final testament. After the wedding, Hitler dictated his last political will and testament. He sat at his desk, his voice weak but firm. In his final words, he blamed the Jews for Germany's defeat and dismissed his generals as cowards. He declared loyalty to the Nazi cause, even in ruin. And finally, he appointed Admiral Dönitz as his successor, to lead what was left of the Reich. The collapse of loyalty. As dawn broke, the bunker fell into quiet chaos. Some officers whispered about surrendering. Others planned to escape through the ruins of Berlin. But a few still clung to the fantasy of victory. Hitler's world was shrinking by the hour. He stopped trusting everyone. Even his closest aides were watched with suspicion. The mighty dictator was now a prisoner of his own paranoia. The final lunch. On April 30th, Hitler ate his final meal, a simple dish of pasta and vegetable soup. He sat with his secretaries, speaking little, lost in thought. One of them, Traudl Young, later recalled that he was calm, almost peaceful. But there was something final in his silence, as if he had already said goodbye to life. Preparations for death. After lunch, Hitler summoned his staff. He shook hands with each of them, a gesture that many realized was a farewell. He thanked them for their service and loyalty, his voice trembling. To some, he muttered, "You have done your duty. The rest is up to fate." The cyanide test. Earlier, Hitler had received cyanide capsules from Heinrich Himmler's doctors. To test them, he ordered his dog Blundi poisoned first. The dog collapsed instantly. Hitler stared silently at the lifeless body of his companion, a moment that broke even his hardened shell. The final goodbye. The atmosphere inside the bunker grew heavier. Everyone knew what was coming. Eva Braun changed into a dark dress. She looked calm, not like a woman about to die, but one resigned to destiny. She whispered to one of the maids, "I'm not afraid." Entering the death room. Around 3:15 p.m., Hitler and Eva walked together toward his private study. He closed the door behind them. Outside, the others waited in silence. Minutes felt like hours. Then a single, sharp sound echoed through the bunker. A gunshot. Discovery. Hitler's aides rushed into the room. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. On the small sofa, Hitler lay dead, with a pistol in his hand. Blood dripped from his temple. Beside her, Eva Braun sat lifeless. She had taken poison. The burning of the bodies. Following Hitler's instructions, his aides wrapped the bodies in blankets. They carried them up the narrow stairwell to the garden above. Outside, the world was chaos, shells exploding, smoke everywhere. The SS officers poured gasoline over the bodies and set them on fire. The last salute. As the flames rose, the men saluted one final time. No one spoke. No one cried. The fire crackled and consumed what was left of their leader. In that burning crater, the dream of the 1,000-year Reich turned to ash. The aftermath. Below ground, silence returned. The war was effectively over, though fighting raged for another day. Some soldiers tried to escape through the ruins of Berlin. Others took their own lives in the bunker. The end had finally come. Goebbels' final act. After Hitler's death, Goebbels became chancellor, but for less than a day. He and his wife Magda made their decision. They would not live in a world without Hitler. The death of the Goebbels children. Magda dressed her 6 children in white nightgowns. She kissed them goodnight and gave each a sleeping pill laced with cyanide. One by one the children died peacefully, unaware of the horror around them. The suicide of the Goebbels. That night, Joseph and Magda Goebbels walked into the garden. They sat side by side, holding hands. A gunshot rang out, then another. Their bodies were burned, as Hitler's had been, though only partially. The fall of the bunker. On May 1st, the last Nazi radio broadcast declared Hitler's heroic death. But inside the bunker, there was no heroism left, only despair. The remaining officers surrendered to Soviet troops the next day. The Reich had fallen. The Soviet discovery. When Soviet soldiers reached the Chancellery Garden, they found charred remains in the shallow crater. Through dental records, they confirmed what the world had only speculated. Adolf Hitler was dead. But Stalin kept the discovery secret, allowing myths and conspiracies to spread for years. The world learns the truth. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Across the world, people celebrated. In Berlin, there was only silence, the silence of defeat and destruction. Reflection. Hitler's death marked not just the fall of a man, but the end of an ideology. An empire built on hate had destroyed itself. Millions of lives were lost to fulfill his vision, and in the end, he too became a victim of his own delusion. The buried bunker. Today, the Führerbunker lies buried beneath modern Berlin. There are no statues, no shrines, only a parking lot. The silence there tells a story more powerful than any monument. The legacy. Hitler's final 48 hours remind us of how tyranny ends, not in glory, but in fear and darkness. Power built on lies and death cannot survive the truth of its own creation. The lesson of history. From the ashes of the Third Reich, a new world emerged, scarred, yet determined to never repeat the same mistakes. The Nuremberg trials that followed revealed the full horror of what had been done in Hitler's name. The end of the war. The flames that consumed Berlin gave birth to a new Europe. Nations rebuilt.
21.
Dissolved.
The walls close in. By the late afternoon of April 29, 1945, the once mighty Third Reich was reduced to a few rooms of concrete, buried beneath the ruins of Berlin. Above ground, Soviet artillery thundered endlessly, shaking dust from the ceiling of the Führerbunker. The entire structure seemed to breathe under fire, every explosion a heartbeat of doom. Inside, the air had grown heavy and stale. The smell of smoke, sweat, and despair hung over every corridor. Hitler's staff moved like shadows, avoiding eye contact, their faces pale and drained. They all knew the truth. The war was over, but no one dared say it aloud. 22. The final reports arrive. As the afternoon wore on, Hitler received the last situational reports from his generals. The maps were meaningless now. Red Soviet arrows covered Berlin entirely. His once grand army was nothing more than fragmented battalions. Reports came that the Soviets were only 500 meters from the Reich Chancellery. Every path to escape was gone. Even the SS troops loyal to Hitler had begun surrendering or disappearing into the chaos. The General of Artillery, Helmut Weidling, who commanded the city's defense, sent word that Berlin would likely fall within a day. He asked permission to negotiate surrender. Hitler refused, slamming his trembling fist against the map table, shouting, "No, Berlin will fight to the last man." But deep inside, even he knew that this was a lie he told himself. 23. The silence between bombs. Between the roaring bombardments, there were moments of haunting quiet. In those silences, the bunker felt like a tomb. Typists paused their work. Secretaries sat frozen, listening to the faint screams and explosions above. Hitler, frail and hollow-eyed, sat on a small sofa, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He stared blankly at the carpet, mumbling occasionally. He had grown old in a matter of days. His once commanding voice was now cracked and faint. His mind flickered between rage and resignation. He refused to believe his empire had fallen, yet every word betrayed a man haunted by the inevitable. 24. The last loyalists. Around him remained only a few loyal figures: Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda, Martin Bormann, Eva Braun, and several aides. They moved quietly, as if afraid to disturb their leader's final moments. Goebbels tried to comfort Hitler with empty words. "My Führer, history will remember your struggle." But even he, the master of propaganda, spoke without conviction. His eyes betrayed the truth. He knew this was the end. Magda Goebbels spent most of the day with her children, brushing their hair, dressing them neatly, and pretending that everything was fine. But in her heart, she had already made a horrifying decision. She would not let them live in a world without Nazi socialism. 25. Eva Braun's calm acceptance. Eva Braun, now Hitler's wife for less than 24 hours, seemed calm, almost serene. She smiled occasionally, comforted the secretaries, and even laughed lightly at times. But her calmness came not from ignorance, it came from acceptance. She had chosen her fate. She had stayed by Hitler's side when everyone else fled. As night approached, she laid out her best dress and applied makeup carefully. If death was coming, she intended to meet it with dignity. 26. The outside world crumbles. Above the bunker, Berlin was collapsing. Entire districts burned uncontrollably. Soviet tanks rolled through the streets, crushing rubble under their treads. Civilians ran for shelter, while SS troops fought desperate last battles around the Reich Chancellery. Every hour, Soviet troops closed in closer. Snipers took positions near the Tiergarten. Artillery fire hit the Chancellery Garden, sending debris raining down on the bunker's concrete roof. By evening, there was no escape route left. The last radio messages from German units were filled with static and panic. The once mighty Reich had shrunk to a few hundred meters of burning ruin. 27. Hitler's descent into delusion. As night fell, Hitler began dictating new orders, commands to armies that no longer existed. He spoke of phantom divisions and miracle counterattacks. His generals nodded silently, unwilling to break the illusion. Then, abruptly, Hitler fell into silence. He took off his glasses and stared into space. His voice softened. "Everything is lost. The German people have failed me." The room froze. No one replied. In that single moment, every person in the bunker understood. Hitler had accepted defeat, but he would never surrender. 28. The farewell messages. Later that night, Hitler ordered his personal secretary, Traudl Junge, to take down his final messages. He dictated his last political testament and his personal will. In his will, he justified his actions, blamed the Jews for the war, and named his successors, Admiral Karl Dönitz as president and Goebbels as chancellor. He refused to flee, declaring that he would remain in Berlin and die there. The room was tense. His words were calm but cold. Each sentence felt like the closing of a chapter in history. After finishing, he signed both documents shakily. Those who witnessed it later said it felt less like a command and more like a confession. 29. The Last Supper in the Bunker. Sometime around 9 p.m., the inner circle gathered for their final meal together. It was a simple supper, pasta and salad, with a bottle of cheap wine. The atmosphere was eerily calm. Hitler ate little. He thanked his staff for their loyalty and urged them to try to escape if they could. His tone was strangely soft, almost fatherly, as if for a brief moment the dictator had turned human again. Those who sat at that table knew they were witnessing history's darkest farewell. 29. The Last Supper in the Bunker. Sometime around 9 p.m., the inner circle gathered for their final meal together. It was a simple supper, pasta and salad, with a bottle of cheap wine. The atmosphere was eerily calm. Hitler ate little. He thanked his staff for their loyalty and urged them to try to escape if they could. His tone was strangely soft, almost fatherly, as if for a brief moment the dictator had turned human again. Those who sat at that table knew they were witnessing history's darkest farewell. 29. The Last Supper in the Bunker. Sometime around 9 p.m., the inner circle gathered for their final meal together. It was a simple supper, pasta and salad, with a bottle of cheap wine. The atmosphere was eerily calm. Hitler ate little. He thanked his staff for their loyalty and urged them to try to escape if they could. His tone was strangely soft, almost fatherly, as if for a brief moment the dictator had turned human again. Those who sat at that table knew they were witnessing history's darkest farewell.
Hitler's second last day, the final 48 hours. The storm above the bunker. April 29, 1945. The final days of the Third Reich. April 29, 1945. Berlin, once the proud capital of Nazi Germany, now lies in ruins. The air is thick with smoke, dust, and the sharp stench of burning metal. Buildings that once displayed the banners of the Third Reich now crumble under relentless Soviet artillery fire. Every explosion shakes the heart of the dying empire. In the heart of this chaos, buried deep beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, lies the Führerbunker, the last refuge of Adolf Hitler. 2 stories underground, sealed in concrete and dimly lit by failing power, this bunker has become both the command center and the tomb of the Third Reich. Inside, fear and hopelessness dominate the air. Hitler's closest followers, once confident in victory, now whisper in despair. Above them, the once mighty German capital is being swallowed by fire and Soviet steel. This is the second last day of Adolf Hitler's life, the 24 hours before his death, when the dictator's empire collapses around him and he finally faces the reality he spent years denying. 1. The bunker below the ruins. As dawn approaches, the bunker feels more like a coffin than a fortress. The walls tremble as shells land above. Dust falls from the ceilings, mixing with the smell of fuel, dampness, and decay. Electricity flickers on and off, casting ghostly shadows on the concrete walls. Every few minutes, the ground shakes. Every few hours, new reports arrive, each one more disastrous than the last. Hitler's once grand empire has shrunk to a few blocks in central Berlin. Above ground, Soviet troops have already reached the city center. They are less than a kilometer from the Reich Chancellery. The thunder of artillery echoes continuously. The Red Army's tanks roll closer with every passing minute. For the men and women trapped underground, there is no escape. The Führerbunker has become a world of its own, isolated, airless, and disconnected from the crumbling world outside. 2. The Fall of a Man. The Adolf Hitler of April 1945 is a far cry from the powerful dictator who once commanded Europe. He is frail, thin, and visibly broken. His body trembles constantly from illness and exhaustion. His hair is gray, his face pale and sunken, his walk unsteady. Once known for fiery speeches and unshakable confidence, Hitler now spends most of his time slumped over a map table, staring at front lines that no longer exist. His generals have either fled, surrendered, or been destroyed. His last armies are surrounded. Witnesses describe him as emotionally unstable, alternating between furious outbursts and eerie calm. His hands shake uncontrollably. His speech is slurred. His mind, clouded by delusion and rage, still clings to the impossible dream of victory. In his mind, defeat is not the failure of his own leadership, but the result of betrayal by his officers, by his allies, and by the German people themselves. He refuses to face the truth. The war is lost,
and the Reich is finished. 3. The news of collapse. By the early hours of April 29th, Hitler receives the last of his military updates. The situation is beyond hopeless. The Red Army has closed its iron ring around the government district. Communications with the outside world have nearly collapsed. The so-called Army of General Wenck, which Hitler believes will save Berlin, no longer exists as a fighting force. Every piece of news confirms one thing: the end has come. The once mighty German war machine lies in ruins. The thousands of men and tanks Hitler ordered into action are now either destroyed or captured. But even as the city falls, Hitler refuses to surrender. In his mind, there are only two options left: victory or death. And since victory is no longer possible, death becomes his only escape. This marks a turning point in his final hours. While the world outside continues to burn, Hitler begins to prepare for his end. 4. The news from Italy, the shadow of fate. Around mid-morning, word reaches the bunker of a grim event. Italy's dictator, Benito Mussolini, has been captured and executed by his own people. His body, along with that of his mistress, has been hung upside down in a public square in Milan. For Hitler, this news is devastating. Mussolini had been his closest ally and the model of fascist leadership he admired, but his gruesome death becomes a terrifying vision of what could await Hitler himself if he is captured by the Allies or the Soviets. From that moment on, one thing becomes certain in Hitler's mind: he will not be taken alive. Whatever happens, he will die on his own terms. This marks a turning point in his final hours. While the world outside continues to burn, Hitler begins to prepare for his end. 5. The decision to marry Eva Braun. By the afternoon of April 29th, in the midst of chaos and destruction, Hitler makes a peculiar decision. He decides to marry Eva Braun, his longtime companion who has stayed with him through the collapse of the Reich. Eva Braun, calm and loyal to the end, has refused to leave Berlin despite every chance to escape. For years, she lived in the shadows, never officially recognized as Hitler's partner. But now, as the world crumbles, Hitler decides to make their relationship official, a final, almost symbolic act before death. Inside the bunker, a small civil ceremony is arranged. It takes place in the dimly lit map room, the same room that once displayed Germany's vast conquests. There are no flowers, no decorations, no music, only the dull echoes of war above. The ceremony is brief and emotionless. The city official, Paul Giad, performs the rites as the few remaining witnesses stand silently. Hitler and Eva Braun exchange bows, their faces pale under the flickering lights. After years of ambition and destruction, Hitler's empire ends not with glory, but with a marriage in the shadows of defeat. Afterward, a few bottles of champagne are opened. There are half-hearted toasts. For a brief moment, the bunker feels almost human again, but beneath that illusion lies the cold reality of what is to come. 6. The Last Will and Testament. Immediately after the short ceremony, Hitler dictates his final will and political testament. The bunker trembles as Soviet shells land nearby, yet he continues to speak with an eerie calm. His will is divided into two parts, one personal, one political. In his personal will, he leaves little behind. Most of his possessions are meaningless now. In his political testament, however, he pours out his anger and delusions. He blames the Jews for the war, accuses his generals of betrayal, and insists that history will vindicate him. In the final lines, he appoints Admiral Karl Donitz as the new head of state, his chosen successor. Even as his empire collapses, Hitler refuses to accept responsibility. His words reflect not a man of remorse, but one lost in self-deception. This document becomes his final attempt to shape history, a delusional effort to control his legacy even as his world falls apart. 7. A toast to the end. After signing his testament, Hitler retires to a small room with Eva Braun. The bunker staff quietly prepare a simple meal, a modest dinner consisting of pasta, soup, and wine. It is a strangely calm moment amid the chaos. The man who once ordered the destruction of nations now sits in silence, knowing that his own destruction is hours away. Outside, the artillery continues to pound the city. Soviet soldiers are now only a few hundred meters from the Reich Chancellery. The last remaining guards can hear the enemy's footsteps approaching through the ruins. But inside, Hitler sits motionless. His face is blank. His voice, when he speaks, is quiet and detached. The world above him is ending, but his mind seems already beyond it. He knows that tomorrow will be his last day. 8. Berlin in ruins. As night falls on April 29th, Berlin is a vision of hell. The city burns in every direction. Entire blocks are flattened. Civilians hide in basements, terrified and hungry. The once proud capital of the Third Reich